Texas, 1884. The hill country had not seen honest rain since March, and the live oaks along the Pedernales held their green like a secret they weren't sure they should keep. Grasshoppers rose off the yellow grass in clouds when a man walked through it, and by noon the limestone hills threw the heat back up at the sky like they wanted no part of it either. He came down off the ridge road on a horse that had seen better years, in a hat that had seen better decades, and he did not stop until he reached the gate of a ranch that announced itself, before he saw a single board of it. By the smell of neglect, dust where there should have been mud, silence where there should have been the clatter of a working yard. His name was Wyatt Renslow, and he had been riding without a fixed direction for the better part of 2 years, which was its own kind of confession, though he had never said it aloud to anyone. The gate hung crooked on one hinge. Beyond it, a house with a sagging porch, a barn missing half its shingles, a corral with 3 horses in it, who looked like they remembered better feed, and in the yard, a woman on her knees in the dirt beside a fallen fence post, working a shovel with the kind of grim, economical fury of someone who has run out of other people to ask for help. She did not hear him until his shadow crossed her, and when she looked up, he saw a face that had been pretty once, and was now simply determined. Sun-browned, a smear of dirt along one cheekbone like a brushstroke. She was young to be alone with a ranch this size, no more than 24, he judged, though the set of her jaw made her look older. "You're on Doss land," she said. Not a greeting. A fact, delivered flat, the shovel still in her hands. "Didn't mean to trespass, ma'am. Saw the gate from the road." He did not dismount. A man learned, riding alone this long, not to get down off his horse uninvited. Post split at the base. Won't hold no matter how deep you set it, I'm aware. She drove the shovel into the ground again, and it told him something that she did not ask him how he knew, did not soften for his benefit. "I don't have money for a hired hand, if that's what you're working toward. I don't have money for much of anything. Wasn't working toward anything." He looked past her, at the barn, the corral, the exhausted set of the whole place. A ranch bleeding out slow, the way ranches did when there was too much land and too few hands and too little water. Just noticed the horses looked thin for June. Something crossed her face then, quick as a bird's shadow, not anger, something closer to grief. "My husband died in January. Winter fever. I've kept it running since, but I am 1 woman and 3 horses too many, and the well's going dry, and if I don't sell half this stock before August, I'll lose the whole herd to hunger instead." She said it plainly, the way a person says a thing they have already cried out and no longer have tears left for. Wyatt sat his horse a moment, listening to the wind move through the dead grass, and something in him, some old unused muscle, turned toward the sound of a person telling the truth about trouble instead of hiding it. "Name's Wyatt Renslow," he said. "I've got no particular place to be this week. I told you, I've got no money to pay a hand. Didn't ask for money." He swung down off the horse slow, giving her time to object if she meant to. She did not. "I'll take a meal and a bedroll in your barn, and when the week's done, I'll ride on. That's the whole of my price." She studied him the way a woman studies a stranger who has just offered her something for nothing, with suspicion first, and under the suspicion a terrible guarded hope. "Why would you do that?" "Because that post won't hold," he said. "And because I've got a week I wasn't using for anything better." It was not the whole truth, but it was the part of the truth he was willing to hand a stranger in a dead yard at noon, and she seemed to understand that some truths come in installments, because she nodded once, sharp, and said, "Ruth Marsh." "There's a pump out back if you're thirsty. 10 cups on the post, Every hand who's worked this place drank from it before he left. You're welcome to it, if you stay." He looked at the cup, nailed by its handle to the weathered post beside the well, dented and sun-faded, and did not yet understand what she meant by it, that every man who had ever worked the Doss Ranch had, in the end, left it and her behind, and the cup was less an invitation than a small, dry joke she told herself to keep from being surprised when he did too. He did not know that yet, but he drank from it anyway, and the water was cold enough to hurt his teeth, and he told himself it was only water. The ranch showed him its wounds slowly, the way any proud thing does. Ruth Marsh's husband, Wyatt learned without asking, had been a gentle man and a poor rancher, and what he had left her was 600 acres of good grass gone to seed for want of proper fencing, a well that needed deepening, a barn roof that let the rain in on the 2 nights a year it fell, and a dun mare, 4 years old, wild-eyed and unbroken, that Ruth called Coffee for the color of her, and would not let anyone touch. She came with the place, Ruth told him that first evening, over a supper of beans and cornbread eaten at a table built for a family that had never arrived. "My husband bought her cheap because nobody else wanted the trouble. Wouldn't let a soul near her. Not even him, in the end." She broken? No, and I expect she never will be. Not by anybody who wants her broken. That's not a horse that gets broken. That's a horse that gets earned. Wyatt turned that over a long while after the lamp was out, and he lay in the barn loft listening to the mare shift and blow in her stall below, and he thought that Ruth Marsh had just told him something about herself she did not know she'd said. He did not push into her house those first nights, did not linger past supper, did not let his eyes stay on her a moment longer than plain conversation required. When she offered him the spare room, narrow, unused since her husband's brother had left 3 winters back, he shook his head and said the barn suited him fine, and she did not argue, though he saw something in her face ease at the offer refused. Some old brace she'd been holding against a man's presumption finally allowed to loosen. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. By the 3rd day he had reset the corral posts, patched the worst of the barn roof, and ridden the fence line twice to map where the wire had rotted through. He worked from before light until the heat drove even the grasshoppers to shade, and in the evenings Ruth brought a plate of whatever the garden and the smokehouse allowed, and they ate on the porch step, because the house still held the day's heat and would not let it go. She did not talk easily. He did not press her to. But on the 4th evening, watching him check a colt's foreleg for heat, she said, without preamble, "You handle a horse like a man who's done it his whole life, not like a man who took it up along the way. Grew up on a horse ranch in the Panhandle. My father ran 300 head before the drought of '74 took most of it." He kept his eyes on the colt's leg, glad of the excuse. "I know horses better than I know most people." "That include Coffee?" He looked over at the dun mare, standing apart from the other stock at the far rail, ears pinned at nothing, watching them both with the flat, ungiving eye of an animal that has decided trust is a luxury it cannot afford. "Not yet," he said, "but I'd like the chance to be wrong about her." Ruth's mouth curved, just at one corner, the first thing near a smile he'd gotten out of her. "That's the first honest thing a man said about that horse since my husband bought her." She did not know then how much weight that sentence carried for him, coming from a man who had spent 2 years being honest about nothing that mattered. The competence revealed itself in her, not in declarations, but in the accumulation of small proofs. On the 5th morning a heifer went down in the east pasture, bloated and groaning, and while Wyatt was still saddling to ride for help, Ruth was already beside the animal with a length of hose and a knife. working with a calm, practiced economy that told him this was not her first time saving a beast alone. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked after, when the heifer had struggled up and the immediate danger had passed. "Where every rancher's wife learns it. There wasn't anybody coming, so I learned to be the somebody." That evening he found her at the corral rail, not speaking to Coffee, not reaching for her, simply standing close enough that the mare could measure the distance herself, humming something low and wordless that might have been a hymn, or might have been nothing at all. The mare's ears, pinned all week, drifted forward, just slightly, just once, before pinning again. Ruth did not startle at the failure. She only kept humming, patient as weather, and Wyatt understood, watching from the barn door, that he had been wrong about which one of them was doing the earning. By the 6th day the fence was sound, the roof no longer leaked, the well had been cleared of the silt choking its draw, and Wyatt Renslow had run out of reasons to still be there except the true one, which he had not yet let himself examine too closely. That night a storm broke, the first real rain since March, coming in sudden and violent off the hills, lightning walking the ridgeline like something with intent. The horses spooked in the corral, and Coffee, always the wildest, went through the top rail before Wyatt could reach the gate, bolting into the black field beyond. Ruth was out of the house before he'd gotten his boots laced, in her nightdress with a shawl thrown over it, running barefoot into the mud without a thought for herself, calling the mare's name into the storm like a woman calling a child. Wyatt caught up to her a quarter-mile out, both of them soaked through, and found her already crouched at the mare's shoulder in the flashing dark, one hand flat and still against the trembling animal's neck, murmuring words too low for the thunder to let him hear. "She let you," he said, when the lightning showed him the mare standing, quivering but caught beneath Ruth's bare hand. "She didn't let me. She needed somebody not to be afraid of her, for once, worse than she needed to run." Ruth did not look at him as she said it, but he understood, the way a man understands a thing said about a horse that is not really about a horse at all, that she had just told him something about herself, and about every hand who had worked this ranch and left without staying to find out what she was worth once the trouble started. They walked the mare home together through the last of the rain, and neither of them spoke, and the silence between them did the work that words would only have gotten wrong. Before the 7th morning came, and it would, too soon for either of them, though neither said so, there was one more supper on the porch step, the air washed clean by the storm, the crickets loud in the wet grass for the first time all summer. If you have stayed with this story so far, stay a little longer. What happens next is the part that changes everything. And if you find yourself moved by tales of love that survive the worst the West could throw at it, the bell beneath this story is how we keep meeting like this. The 7th morning arrived gray and cool, the drought's grip loosened at least for a day, and Wyatt saddled his own horse in silence while Ruth stood at the barn door with something folded in her hands. "I can't pay you in money," she said. "I told you that from the start. But I've thought on it all week, and there's one thing on this place worth more than a week's wages, and I want you to have her." She led Coffee out by a rope loose enough that the mare could have refused it, and hadn't. The dun stood calm at Ruth's shoulder, ears forward. The wildness in her settled into something that watched Wyatt now, without flinching. "Take the horse," Ruth said. "She's worth 4 times what I could ever pay you, and she trusts you near as much as she trusts me now. It's the only fair price I've got." Wyatt looked at the mare a long moment, at what she represented, the whole week distilled into one animal finally willing to be caught. And then he looked at Ruth, standing in the gray morning light with the rope in her hand and something naked in her face that she was trying hard to keep ordinary. He shook his head. I can't take her. She's not charity, if that's what you're too proud for. She's payment. Fair payment for fair work. It isn't pride. He said it slow, working to find words for a thing he had not let himself say aloud even to himself until the words were already leaving him. If I take that horse, ma'am, then I've been paid, and a paid man rides on and owes nothing further to anybody. I've been a paid man before. I know exactly how light it sits on a fellow, riding off owing nothing. He looked at the mare, then back at her. I'd rather ride off owing you a reason to come back than ride off even. Ruth Marsh stood very still. The rope went slack in her hand. That's a strange kind of payment to prefer. Maybe, but it's the only kind that's ever felt like it meant anything. He gathered his own horse's reins. You keep the mare. You earned her trust. I only watched you do it. If I want a horse worth having, I expect I'll have to earn one same as you did. And if you don't come back? She asked, and there was no coyness in it. Only the flat, guarded question of a woman who had watched every man who ever worked this land ride off and mean it as a permanent thing. Then you'll have lost nothing you didn't already have, Wyatt said, and you can go on telling yourself that Cup on the Well Post was right about me same as it's been right about every man before me. But if I do come back, he stopped himself there. The sentence too large yet to finish standing in a barnyard at 7 days' acquaintance, and instead he touched his hat brim, and said only, Much obliged for the meals, Mrs. Marsh, and for the water. He rode out through the crooked gate without looking back, though it cost him something in the spine to manage it, and Ruth Marsh stood in the yard with a mare she had not expected to keep, and a question she could not stop turning over. What kind of man refuses a horse to earn instead the right to return to a ranch that offers him nothing certain at all? He did not tell her, because there had not yet been a day in 7 when the telling would not have sounded like an excuse, that the reason he had been riding without a fixed direction for 2 years was that he had spent the 3 years before that riding with men who called themselves the Hollis Gang, and that the last job. A bank in Fredericksburg that had gone wrong in every way a thing can go wrong, had left one guard dead and Wyatt Renslow the only rider who had not fired his weapon, a fact that mattered a great deal to his own conscience and not at all to a federal warrant that used his name. He had walked away from the gang the same week and had been riding the back roads of 3 territories ever since, doing weeks' work here and months' work there, never staying long enough for anyone to ask the questions that mattered. Ruth Marsh's ranch was the first place in 2 years he had wanted to stay past the leaving. He rode north into the hill country, working odd jobs, breaking horses outside Fredericksburg under a foreman who did not ask questions, laying fence for a German settler family near the Llano River, and every dollar he earned beyond his food and lodging he set aside in a tobacco tin, because he had told himself a true thing without saying it plain even in his own head, that he meant to go back to the Doss Ranch with more than an empty saddle and a debt of memory, and that a woman who had been left by every hand who ever worked her land deserved to be returned to by a man who arrived with something in his hands besides apology. 3 weeks into his wandering, in a cantina outside Llano, he heard the name that changed the shape of his return. Hollis Gang, a cavalry corporal was saying to another man over warm beer, loud with the carelessness of a man who does not know who is listening. Lieutenant colonels got half of Company C combing the hill country for the last 2 of them. Word is one's gone soft, settled somewhere quiet under his own name, if you can believe a man that stupid. Wyatt did not turn his head, did not let his hand still on his glass, and left before the second beer was finished. But the words rode with him after that, soft, settled somewhere quiet, and he understood that whatever peace he had found at Ruth Marsh's ranch, and whatever he meant to build there, he would have to build it standing in the open, in his own true name, in front of a woman and a community that had every reason, once they knew, to run him off with worse than a shovel. He decided, riding the long road back toward the Pedernales in late September with the tobacco tin heavier than when he'd left, that he would tell her the truth before he told her anything else. A man did not earn a reason to come back by hiding the reason he'd had to leave in the first place. He rode back through the crooked gate on a gray morning in October, 4 months since the drought had broken and the hills had gone from yellow to a green, so sudden it looked almost apologetic for the wait. He came leading a second horse, not Coffee, whom he'd left behind on purpose, but a sound bay gelding, saddle broke and steady, purchased with 4 months of set-aside wages, along with a new roll of good wire for the fence he knew from memory would need it again by spring, and a tin of coffee, real coffee, because Ruth Marsh had told him once on the porch step that she had not tasted real coffee since her husband died and could no longer justify the expense on herself alone. She was at the well when he rode in, and she straightened at the sound of hooves, and Wyatt watched her face move through disbelief, then something guarded, then something she did not try very hard to keep hidden. "You came back," she said, when he dismounted, as if she needed to say the fact aloud to trust it. "Told you I would, if I could earn the reason. Whose horse is that?" "Mine, bought and paid for." "Didn't want you thinking I'd come back just to finally take the one you offered." He held out the tin of coffee instead, and she took it, and looked at it a long moment as though it were worth more than the mare had ever been, which, he understood, watching her, it very nearly was, being not payment but choice, freely made, carried 4 months and 40 miles. "There's things I owe you the truth of," he said, before she could speak again, before the moment could soften into something he had not yet earned the right to let it soften into. "Things I should have said before I ever slept a night in your barn, only I didn't know yet if I meant to come back, and it seemed a poor use of a woman's trust to hand her a burden I might not stay to help carry." He told her there, standing by the well with the tin cup hanging silent on its nail between them, all of it, the Hollis gang, the bank in Fredericksburg, the guard who had died by another man's bullet, and the warrant that did not care whose hand had pulled which trigger, the 2 years of riding without a fixed direction, because a man running from a rope does not get to plant himself anywhere long, enough to be found. Ruth listened without moving, her face giving him nothing, and when he finished she was quiet long enough that he understood the silence itself as its own kind of verdict. "My husband," she said at last, "was a gentle, honest man who never once in his life had to choose between what was right and what was safe, and he ran this ranch into the ground because he never learned that gentleness alone doesn't hold fence posts up." She looked at him steadily. "You walked away from men who'd have killed for you, without firing a shot yourself, and you've spent 2 years paying a debt that isn't rightly yours to pay, and you came back here anyway, with a warrant hanging over you, to tell a widow woman the truth before you'd let yourself want anything from her." Her voice did not shake. "That's not a confession that frightens me, Wyatt Renslow. That's the first evidence I've had in a long while that decency and cost aren't opposites. There's cost coming regardless," he said. "If Company C finds me here, it won't matter what I did or didn't fire. They'll take me same as the others. Then we'll cross that when it rides up the lane," she said, "and not one day before." It was not the answer of a woman guaranteed safety. It was the answer of a woman who had decided, the way she had decided about the mare, that some trust was worth extending before it was fully earned, because the extending was itself a kind of earning. Wyatt Renslow, standing in a barnyard he had ridden 4 months and 40 miles to return to, understood that he had just been given something he had stopped believing a man in his position could still receive. "I don't love easy things," he said low, the words costing him the way true words always had, never did know how to. "But I've thought about this ranch and this well and this fool tin cup on the post every night for 4 months, and I don't reckon that's a man thinking about easy. I reckon that's a man who's found the one thing in 2 years of running that was worth the risk of standing still for." He did not kiss her then. It was not yet the moment for it, and both of them seemed to know it, the truth still too freshly spoken between them to make room for anything but the plain fact of having spoken it. But she reached out, slow, and closed her hand over his where it rested on the well post, and held it there a long moment in the October light, and something in both of them settled that had been unsettled a very long while. Company C found him in November. Ruth had known it was coming. Wyatt had told her plainly it might, and she had not asked him to hide or run, only to stay and finish the fence, because she said a man who ran from trouble twice never stopped running. And she had married enough gentleness in her life to know the difference between a man who was gentle and a man who was merely afraid. The lieutenant who rode up the lane on a gray afternoon was young, correct, and carried a warrant with Wyatt Renslow's true name on it in a clerk's careful hand. Behind him rode 6 troopers, and behind the troopers, unasked and unwelcome, rode Denton Pike, the neighboring rancher who had wanted the Doss water rights since before Ruth's husband died, and had, Wyatt would learn later, been the one to write the letter to Fredericksburg naming a stranger seen working the Marsh Ranch back in June. "Wyatt Renslow," the lieutenant said, "from horseback. You're wanted in connection with the Fredericksburg robbery of March last, and the death of one Henry Coates, bank guard." "I didn't fire on Henry Coates," Wyatt said, standing in the yard with his hands visible and still. "Didn't fire my weapon at all that day. I'll stand trial and say so under oath, and there's 2 other men still riding who can be made to say the same if you find them and ask hard enough. That's for a judge to weigh, not me." Ruth stepped down off the porch then, into the space between the lieutenant's horse and Wyatt, and Denton Pike, from the back of the troop, called out, loud enough for all to hear, "Careful, Lieutenant. The widow Marsh has taken up harboring outlaws now, along with wild horses nobody else would touch. Might ask what else she's been keeping quiet on that ranch." The insinuation in it was ugly and plain, and Wyatt felt something go hard and cold in his chest. The old instinct to answer insult with violence rising fast, and he put it down, hard, because he had promised himself, riding back through that gate, that he would be a different kind of man than the one who had ridden with the Hollis gang. And a different kind of man did not answer a coward's insult with his fists in front of a woman he meant to marry. "Say what you came to say about me, Pike," Wyatt said instead, quiet, "and leave her out of your mouth entirely, or I'll make sure the lieutenant hears exactly why you've been so eager to see this ranch fail since before I ever rode on to it." Ruth did not wait for either man to answer. She looked at the lieutenant directly, her voice steady as the well water. "This man worked my land for a week in June for nothing but a meal and a barn floor, and rebuilt what my husband's death had let fall apart, and rode off without taking a horse worth 4 times his wages, because he said he'd rather earn the right to come back than leave paid and even. He came back in October and told me the truth of his past before he asked me for one thing in return. I don't know what kind of man rode with the Hollis gang 2 years ago, I know the man who's been mending my fence and courting my trust honest since June, and I'll say so to any judge in this territory." The lieutenant studied her a long moment, then Wyatt, then looked back once at Denton Pike with an expression that suggested he had already formed his own opinion of which party in this yard deserved his suspicion. "I've a warrant to execute, ma'am, not a character study to conduct. Misty, Renslow will need to come to Fredericksburg to answer the charge." "Then I'll come to Fredericksburg, too," Ruth said, "and I'll bring every neighbor within 10 miles who's watched this man work an honest week for nothing, and we'll see what a territorial judge makes of a warrant built on one dead guard nobody can prove he shot, and one jealous neighbor's letter." The trial, when it came in December, was shorter than anyone expected. 2 former hands from the Doss Ranch and a surviving teller from the Fredericksburg Bank, tracked down at Ruth's own insistence, testified under oath that the tall rider had stood with his weapon lowered the whole while and had helped carry the wounded guard to the doctor's wagon before the gang scattered. It was not innocence exactly that the judge found in him. Wyatt had ridden with outlaws and would carry that a long while yet in the eyes of some, but it was enough doubt, weighed against a jealous neighbor's motive, to send him home instead of to a cell. Denton Pike did not trouble the Marsh Ranch again. Whatever standing he had hoped to gain by exposing a scandal, he lost instead in the telling of how the letter came to be written, and a rancher's word carries less weight in a county once his neighbors have watched him try to use the law as a weapon against a widow's water rights. By spring the drought was a memory the grass had already forgotten, and the Doss Ranch, though Ruth had begun, in conversation, to simply call it the ranch, without her late husband's name attached, which Wyatt understood as its own kind of moving forward, wore its green like something it had never expected to keep. He built her a proper porch swing that sprang, out of cedar he'd cut and cured himself, and hung it from the same beam where the old sagging boards had once creaked a warning to anyone who sat too heavy. Coffee, the dun mare, had a foal at her side by April, sired by Wyatt's own bay gelding, and Ruth named the colt Second Chance without a trace of embarrassment at how plainly the name explained itself. They married at the river bend in May, without ceremony beyond a circuit preacher and the handful of neighbors who had ridden to Fredericksburg to speak for him. Ruth in a dress she'd sewn herself from cloth Wyatt had brought back from Austin, and when the preacher pronounced them married, Wyatt did not kiss her the way a man kisses a woman he has finally won. He kissed her the way a man kisses a debt he is glad, for the whole rest of his life, to keep paying. Slow, certain, and it broke something open in her chest that 4 months of careful courting and one honest confession by a well-post had already half undone, the last of the guard she had kept up since her first husband's funeral finally letting go entire. The tin cup still hung on its nail by the well-post, and neither of them had ever spoken of taking it down. But that autumn, riding in from the east pasture, Wyatt noticed Ruth had nailed a second cup beside it, newer, unscratched, and when he asked her why, she only said, "So the well remembers there's one man who stayed," and went on with her work as though she had not just told him the truest thing she had ever said. Out on the long plains of Texas, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Wyatt Renslow and Ruth Marsh became the kind that did not need a bank's exoneration or a neighbor's silence to be real, only a mare gentled by patience, a fence mended twice, and a cup on a well post that finally, after so many leavings, got to stay full. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, false accusation, and the kind of silence only the West knows speak to you, follow the Lonesome Trail for more. Here the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.